A retired doctor made an extraordinary discovery that was about to challenge everything we know about humanity. In the vast plains of Montana, during a seemingly ordinary walk, she stumbled upon something that would change her life forever. A skull of giant proportions, buried for millennia in the wilderness. What began as scientific curiosity transformed into a mystery that would consume 15 years of rigorous investigation, academic debates, and fundamental questions about our history. This discovery would test the limits of modern science and reveal an identity that no one could have imagined. This is the story of the giant skull found in Montana. Dr. Harold Mitchell had always been a man of routine. After 37 years as a surgeon at Billings General Hospital, retirement at 68 had left him with more time than he knew what to do with. His wife Margaret had passed away 3 years earlier, and their children lived scattered across the country, busy with their own lives and careers. The silence of their empty ranch house on the outskirts of Bozeman had become deafening. It was Margaret who had first suggested he take up hiking. "Harold," she had said during one of her final lucid moments before the cancer took her, "you've spent your whole life looking at bones and bodies in sterile rooms. Maybe it's time you explored what's buried out there in God's country." Her words echoed in his mind every morning as he laced up his hiking boots and headed into the Montana wilderness. On that crisp October morning in 2008, Dr. Mitchell chose a trail he had never explored before, a remote path that wound through the Badlands northeast of Bozeman. The area was known to paleontologists and fossil hunters, but Harold wasn't looking for dinosaur bones. He was simply seeking the peace that came from walking in places where human footsteps were rare, and the silence was profound. The trail led him through a landscape that seemed frozen in time. Red sandstone formations jutted from the earth like ancient monuments, and the only sounds were the whisper of wind through sagebrush and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk. Harold had been walking for nearly 2 hours when he decided to rest on a rocky outcrop that offered a commanding view of the valley below. As he sat drinking water from his thermos, something caught his eye in a small ravine about 50 feet below his position. At first, it looked like nothing more than an unusual rock formation, a pale, rounded shape partially exposed beneath layers of sediment and scattered debris. But Harold's medical training had given him an intimate familiarity with bone structure, and something about the shape nagged at his scientific instincts. Curiosity overcoming caution, he carefully made his way down the steep slope, using his walking stick for balance on the loose scree. As he got closer, his heart began to race. The pale object wasn't a rock at all. It was unmistakably bone, and the curved surface suggested the distinctive shape of a skull. But this wasn't just any skull. Even partially buried, Harold could see that it was massive, easily twice the size of any human skull he had encountered in his decades of medical practice. His hands shaking with excitement, he knelt beside the partially exposed remains and began carefully brushing away dirt and debris. "Jesus Christ," he whispered to the empty wilderness as more of the skull became visible. The bone structure was clearly humanoid, but the proportions were impossible. The eye sockets alone were nearly twice the normal size, and the overall cranial capacity suggested a brain volume that defied everything he knew about human anatomy. Harold pulled out his phone and began documenting his discovery, taking dozens of photographs from every angle. He measured the exposed portions using a small ruler he always carried, a habit from his surgical days when precision was everything. The visible section of the skull measured over 18 inches in length, and he estimated the complete structure would be even larger. As a man of science, Harold knew he needed to proceed carefully. This wasn't just an interesting find. If his initial assessment was correct, This could be one of the most significant anthropological discoveries in North American history. But he also knew that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and the scientific establishment didn't take kindly to amateurs making grandiose assertions about revolutionary discoveries. His first call was to the Park County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Tom Bradley had known Harold for years. They'd met countless times in the emergency room when Harold had treated victims of accidents and violence. If anyone would take his report seriously, it would be Tom. "Harold, you're telling me you found a giant skull out in the Badlands?" Sheriff Bradley's voice carried a mixture of skepticism and concern. "Are you sure it's not just an animal skull? Maybe a bear or an elk with some kind of deformity?" "Tom, I've been looking at skulls and bones for nearly 40 years. I know the difference between human and animal anatomy. This is definitely humanoid, but it's unlike anything in the medical literature." "All right, Doc. Give me the GPS coordinates. I'll send Deputy Martinez out there to take a look, but it'll probably be tomorrow morning before we can get up there." But Harold could hear in Tom's voice the same polite skepticism he would encounter repeatedly over the following months. When Deputy Martinez arrived at the site the next day, he spent less than 30 minutes examining the remains before concluding that Harold had likely discovered the skull of a large animal, possibly a bear that had suffered from some kind of bone disease. "Dr. Mitchell, I appreciate you reporting this, but I don't see anything here that suggests we're dealing with anything unusual," Martinez said, barely glancing at the carefully documented measurements and photographs Harold had prepared. "These Badlands are full of animal bones from all kinds of creatures. Sometimes they can look pretty strange after being buried for years." The dismissal stung, but Harold wasn't ready to give up. Over the following weeks, he contacted every relevant expert he could find. He reached out to the anthropology departments at Montana State University and the University of Montana. He called the Museum of the Rockies, famous for its paleontological discoveries. He even sent emails to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. Each response followed the same disappointing pattern. Initial polite interest would quickly give way to skepticism when Harold described the size and characteristics of the skull. Most experts assumed he had misidentified animal remains or had been deceived by unusual rock formations. Dr. Sarah Chen at Montana State was typical of the responses he received. "Dr. Mitchell, I understand your excitement about your discovery, but what you're describing simply doesn't exist in the archaeological record. The largest confirmed human skulls are only marginally larger than modern averages. If such remains existed, they would have been discovered and documented long ago." But Harold knew what he had seen and touched. The smooth texture of ancient bone, the unmistakable anatomical features, the precise measurements he had recorded. These weren't tricks of imagination or wishful thinking. His medical training had taught him to trust empirical evidence over theoretical assumptions. As months turned into years, Harold found himself caught in a frustrating cycle of documentation and rejection. He returned to the site regularly, carefully expanding his excavation and discovering additional bone fragments that only confirmed his original assessment. He found what appeared to be portions of arm bones and ribs, all proportionally oversized but maintaining human anatomical characteristics. By 2012, 4 years after his initial discovery, Harold had amassed hundreds of photographs, detailed measurements, and even small bone samples that he had carefully collected for potential analysis. But every attempt to interest the scientific establishment had ended in polite dismissal or outright rejection. The isolation began to wear on him. Friends and neighbors had started referring to him as the doctor with the giant skull obsession. Some people whispered that grief over Margaret's death had affected his judgment, that his claims about prehistoric giants were the product of a mind struggling with loss and loneliness. But Harold's conviction never wavered. He had spent too many years studying human anatomy to be mistaken about something so fundamental. The skull was real. It was human, and it represented something unprecedented in the archaeological record of North America. The breakthrough came in 2015, 7 years after his initial discovery, when Harold's nephew David visited for Thanksgiving. David was a forensic scientist with the FBI, specializing in the analysis of skeletal remains in criminal investigations. Harold had mentioned his discovery to David over the years, but had never pressed the issue, knowing that his nephew worked in law enforcement rather than archaeology. "Uncle Harold, I've been thinking about that skull you found," David said over coffee on Thanksgiving morning. "You know, we have access to some pretty sophisticated analysis techniques at the Bureau. Carbon dating, DNA extraction, comparative database searches. If you're really convinced this is something significant, maybe it's worth taking a more scientific approach." Harold felt his heart leap with hope for the first time in years. "David, would you really be willing to look at this? I mean, officially?" "Well, not officially. The FBI doesn't investigate archaeological discoveries, but I have some vacation time coming up, and I know people at private labs who owe me favors. If you're serious about this, maybe we can get some definitive answers." 2 weeks later, David Mitchell stood in the Montana Badlands, staring at the carefully exposed remains his uncle had been protecting and documenting for 7 years. As a forensic expert who had examined thousands of skeletal remains, David's reaction was immediate and profound. "Uncle Harold," he said quietly, "this isn't just significant. This is potentially world-changing." The skull was even more remarkable than Harold's photographs had suggested. The bone structure was clearly human, but the proportions challenged every assumption about human physical development. David estimated the cranial capacity at nearly double that of a modern human, suggesting either a pathological condition unlike anything in the medical literature, or something even more extraordinary. "We need to get this to a lab immediately," David said, his professional excitement barely contained. "I know a guy at a private facility in Denver who specializes in ancient DNA extraction. If we can get genetic material from this, we'll have definitive answers about what we're dealing with." The next 6 months were a whirlwind of careful analysis and growing excitement. Dr. Elena Rodriguez at the Denver Forensic Laboratory was initially skeptical, but her skepticism quickly transformed into amazement as test results began to confirm what Harold had claimed for years. "Mr. Mitchell," she said during a conference call in June 2016, "I need to tell you that your samples have produced some of the most unusual results I've ever encountered in 15 years of forensic analysis." Harold gripped the phone tightly, his heart pounding. "What did you find, Dr. Rodriguez?" "First, the carbon dating confirms that these remains are approximately 12,000 years old, placing them at the end of the last ice age. Second, we were able to extract sufficient DNA for analysis, and the results are unprecedented." "What do you mean, unprecedented?" "The DNA is definitely human. Homo sapiens, no question about it. But there are genetic markers that I've never seen before. Markers that suggest this individual possessed a natural form of gigantism, but without any of the pathological conditions we associate with such extreme height in modern populations." David leaned forward in his chair. "Dr. Rodriguez, what kind of height are we talking about?" "Based on the skull size and the additional bone fragments you provided, I estimate this individual stood between 9 and 10 feet tall. But here's what's really extraordinary. The bone density and joint structure suggest this wasn't a medical abnormality. This appears to have been a naturally occurring human variant. The silence that followed lasted nearly a minute, as Harold processed the implications of what he was hearing. After 8 years of skepticism and rejection, science had finally confirmed what he had known from the moment he first saw the skull. But Dr. Rodriguez wasn't finished. There's something else. The DNA analysis revealed markers suggesting this individual was female, approximately 35 to 40 years old at the time of death. And gentlemen, there are indicators that she may have died from trauma rather than natural causes. What kind of trauma? Harold asked. There are microscopic fracture patterns in the skull that suggest blunt force impact. This woman may have been murdered. The revelation transformed Harold's archaeological discovery into something approaching a criminal investigation. If this giant woman had been killed, then her death represented not just a scientific mystery, but potentially one of the oldest unsolved murders in North American history. David's law enforcement background kicked into overdrive. Dr. Rodriguez, is there any way to determine more about the circumstances of her death? We'd need to examine the complete skeleton, and ideally the immediate area where she was found. There might be additional evidence that could tell us more about what happened to her. Over the following months, a careful excavation of Harold's site revealed additional remains that painted an increasingly clear picture of the woman's final moments. The complete skeleton confirmed Dr. Rodriguez's estimates. This had been a woman of extraordinary height, with bone structure suggesting tremendous physical strength. More disturbing were the additional injuries documented during the careful analysis of her remains. Besides the obvious skull trauma, there were defensive wounds on her arms and hands, suggesting she had fought desperately against her attacker. Most chilling of all was the discovery of a stone projectile point lodged between her ribs, clear evidence that she had been killed with weapons. This woman was hunted, Dr. Rodriguez concluded during her final report presentation. The pattern of injuries suggests multiple attackers using both blunt weapons and projectiles. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was systematic, coordinated killing. But who was this extraordinary woman, and why had she been killed? The answers came from an unexpected source: archaeological evidence discovered during the expanded excavation of the site. Hidden beneath centuries of sediment, the team found artifacts that suggested this location had once been a significant settlement. Stone tools, pottery fragments, and the remains of what appeared to be permanent structures painted a picture of a sophisticated culture that had thrived in this region 12,000 years ago. Most remarkable of all was a series of carved stone tablets discovered in what appeared to have been a ceremonial chamber. The carvings depicted figures of extraordinary height, engaged in what seemed to be leadership activities, directing construction projects, presiding over gatherings, and leading what appeared to be military campaigns. Dr. James Whitehorse, a specialist in prehistoric Native American cultures, was brought in to analyze the carvings and their cultural context. His conclusions were startling. These tablets suggest that individuals of exceptional height held positions of significant authority in this culture, he explained. The woman Dr. Mitchell discovered appears to have been not just a member of this community, but possibly a leader or even a ruler. Are you saying she was some kind of ancient queen? Harold asked. That may not be far from the truth. The archaeological evidence suggests this was a matriarchal society where physical stature was associated with political and spiritual authority. This woman may have been killed not in a random act of violence, but as part of a systematic campaign to eliminate the leadership class of her people. The final piece of the puzzle came from genetic analysis that compared the woman's DNA with that of modern Native American populations. The results revealed that she shared genetic markers with several contemporary tribes, but with variations that suggested her people represented a distinct population group that had largely disappeared from the historical record. We're looking at evidence of what may have been a genocidal campaign conducted 12,000 years ago, Dr. Whitehorse concluded. A population of giants who ruled this region was systematically eliminated by rival groups, possibly because their physical advantages made them too powerful to coexist with. Harold Mitchell stood in the Denver laboratory, looking at the reconstructed skull that had consumed 15 years of his retirement, and felt a profound mixture of vindication and sadness. He had set out to satisfy scientific curiosity and had uncovered evidence of an ancient tragedy that had erased an entire people from history. "Dr. Mitchell," Dr. Rodriguez said, "I want you to know that your persistence in the face of professional skepticism has led to one of the most significant anthropological discoveries of the century. This woman's story might have remained buried forever if you hadn't refused to accept dismissal." The discovery of what became known as the Montana Giantess fundamentally altered scientific understanding of prehistoric North American populations. Follow-up excavations at the site revealed evidence of an entire settlement populated by individuals of extraordinary height, along with artifacts suggesting a level of cultural sophistication that challenged existing theories about Ice Age societies. Museums around the world requested permission to display replicas of the skull and artifacts. Universities established research programs dedicated to studying the genetic and cultural implications of the discovery. Most importantly, the find inspired a new appreciation for the observations of citizen scientists who pursue knowledge outside traditional academic channels. 5 years after the initial scientific confirmation of his discovery, Harold Mitchell stood before an audience at the Smithsonian Institution, delivering a lecture about his find to some of the world's leading anthropologists and archaeologists. "When I first found that skull," he told the assembled experts, "I was just a lonely old man looking for something to fill his days. I never imagined I would help give voice to a woman who had been silenced for 12,000 years. Her story reminds us that the past is full of peoples and cultures that have vanished from memory, but whose experiences remain buried in the earth, waiting for someone curious enough to listen." The Montana Giantess, as she came to be known in scientific literature, had finally found her voice through the persistence of a retired surgeon who refused to accept that her story was too extraordinary to be true. Her legacy lived on not just in the artifacts and bones that Harold had preserved, but in the reminder that the most important discoveries often come from the most unexpected sources. In his final interview about the discovery, Harold reflected on the 15-year journey from that first moment of recognition in the Montana Badlands to international scientific acclaim. "Margaret always told me that retirement was my chance to explore what was buried out there in God's country," he said. "I don't think either of us imagined I'd end up uncovering someone who had been waiting 12,000 years for her story to be told." Sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries are made not by famous scientists, but by ordinary people who simply refuse to ignore what they know is important. The giant skull that had started as a curious anomaly in the Montana wilderness had become a window into a lost world, proof that the past holds secrets waiting to be discovered by anyone with the courage to look and the determination to never stop seeking the truth.